So, first of all, thanks a lot for introducing. It's a pleasure actually to present our content here. It's all about risk management, even in that times, and then also particularly in the automotive industry, we would like to elaborate. But before we start, let's introduce ourselves. Thomas, why you start with a brief introduction, and then I go ahead.
Thanks, Andreas. My name is Thomas Steinberger. I'm a partner with PwC in Germany for the last more than 15 years. I'm with the firm and I'm doing almost exclusively distressed supplier projects and engagements. So I worked in this industry for a pretty long time. I worked for OEMs, I worked for suppliers, and I worked for all other stakeholders there. So my part is the second part of this session, and I will talk about the practical implications and how supply chain risk management is currently conducted in the industry and what implications we see going forward on that very complex supply chain. Back to you, Andreas.
Okay, thanks a lot, Thomas. Just briefly regarding myself before we step into the presentation, my name is Andreas Gissler. I'm a partner colleague actually of Thomas. I'm here in Strategy N, so PwC company, and I'm responsible actually for automotive as well as mobility from the Strategy N side. And I also conducted several cases, especially when we talk about risk management as well as risk avoidance, especially in the automotive industry. And I'm really happy to present the first part. Yeah, if we dive into the first part, I would like to start with a few quotations. I don't really want to go into the detail, but I mean what we've experienced, especially in the March time, due to Corona. I mean, it was a really disruptive time for for the automotive OEM on the one hand side, as well as for the different suppliers along the tiers. So for tier 1 suppliers, tier 2, as well as tier 3. If we go briefly to the next page, and what I would like to mention is that the crisis is still there, right? It's not yet over, and we'll see a lot of different kind of implication in the future. If we go to the next page, I would like to talk a little bit about external as well as internal challenges that we see. And the external as well as the internal challenges make it very important to react actually on the one hand side. So there are reactive actions as well as predictive actions. But let me start with the external changes that we see. So we have a decreasing as well as demanding changing demand in different markets that we've seen, also based or affected from the lockdown that we experienced. And so we had a lot of different kind of supply chain disruptions and of course economic uncertainties in the different markets. So that's more on the external side. What we experience on the internal side, there were also some challenges regarding, for example, the entire supply chain as well as production. So we had production stops or also close downs. We had to handle limited workforces as well as financial issues. And so on the one hand side, we've seen that reactive actions, so we had to react immediately, but on the other side, there are predictive actions to ensure actually business continuity immediately as well as in the future. Yeah, if we go to the next page, the most important thing when we talk about risk management, mitigation of risks, different kind of measures, it's always having the transparency about the entire logistic also. And what we see here, we have some external factors, internal factors, and let me start with the customer side. Here we'll have changes also based on the customer demand in the different markets on the one hand side, and also On the other side, we do have some suppliers where we have to rely on, and it's really, really important that we have the entire transparency about the holistic supply chain that we have, also to manage our supply chain and also to see where the most important risks might be currently as well as in the future. So this is really important, and it starts always with that transparency on the one hand side, and on the other side with the risks that might occur, that we make transparent on the one hand side and that we evaluate on the other side. If we come to the next page, and that's how we normally actually deal with that, we build a holistic risk management for our clients, also taking into consideration different kind of data sources that are available. And here we have global data sources, for example, to evaluate the operational risk, the financial risk, the geopolitical risk, regulatory risks, as well as some social medias we also take into consideration. And we use that data sources actually to build an entire risk management. And with that entire risk management, we can actually make the entire supply chain network transparent, and also the risks that might occur, as well as we can zoom into each supplier and also evaluate probably the risk that this supplier is going to be bankrupt, or if there are other major risks that might occur, also that affect our supply chain. And that's how we do actually. On the one hand side, we make the supply chain, the entire supply chain, transparent. We also make transparent what kind of stakeholders are involved and what major risks might occur currently as well as in the future. And just to give you a brief overview of the different kind of tools actually that are working with, that's on the next page. So we have here, for example, very prominent our supplier risk profile tool. That's more or less evaluating the risk of such one node, where we can evaluate the different suppliers that we're using. So also along the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And of course, we can also make the entire risk transparent for our supplier network. Yeah. And therefore, we have different kind of tools in place. We also work with different AIs, with different algorithms there. And then we have a pretty comprehensive model, and we're able to predict the risks based on probably shutdowns and so on. How this works normally is shown on the next page. So just giving you a very brief overview here, how we work in projects. So it's all about assessment, what I said at the beginning, yeah, generating the transparency that we need regarding the entire supply chain. Then we evaluate the risks, and then we come up with mitigation risk plans. And then, of course, we execute. Yeah, if we see a risk, we deal with that immediately. And then also we take that as an opportunity for continuous improvement. And that's normally how we do it, to build up really nice and comprehensive models for different kind of industries, but also especially in the automotive industry. And now Thomas is coming actually with the second part to drill a little bit deeper, especially on the risk side for suppliers, which is really important now as well as in the future. But now back to you, Thomas.
Thanks, Andreas. Thanks for the brief overview about how we see risk management from a, let's call it, holistic angle. And now I would like to dive a little bit deeper into the automotive supply chain. First of all, let me start with a few comments about the current situation. The industry in total has a very complex supply chain with many interdependencies. We're talking about more than 3,000 suppliers per car manufacturer, many of the supply chain involving 2 to 3 sub-suppliers called tier 1, tier 2, tier 3s across different continents, and also many of these in so-called just-in-time or just-in-sequence supply chains with minimal room for error or disruption. In a just-in-sequence delivery, we see a time window of approximately 45 minutes where in a given sequence, a product has to be delivered to the OEM plant. So these are very, very tight regulations and specifics for this supply chain. If we're talking about distress in the automotive supply chain currently, we saw even early signs of the distress in the supply chain before COVID. On a very high level, we can summarize the distress basically in three factors or three categories. The first is operational distress. On a functional level, we saw the EBIT margin going down in 2019 by 1.8%. The estimation for 2020 is even higher. We're talking 4% less EBIT for the German suppliers here. And it's a third consecutive year with decreasing margins. So overall, there were also already a lot of clouds on the horizon for the whole industry or the whole supply chain from an earnings point of view. And COVID will destroy the 2020 earnings of many suppliers. But not only the profitability, but also the pure performance is a problem. Already pre-COVID, we had 35% of suppliers which had major problems in delivering SOPs, start of production failures. This is basically the launch of a new product. This is very costly and in many cases can be healed even over lifetime. And in many cases also comes to a rather threatening distress situation for the whole supplier. On a strategic level, we will not see pre-COVID levels on the sales side before 2023, in some regions even later. So we're facing an industry which has basically no growth over the next years. And the transformation to e-mobility and autonomous drive will further increase the consolidation in the market, therefore having less suppliers with a product risk concentration on the OEM side. Last but not least, financial side of the business. Many of the suppliers solved, or not solved, but tried to survive COVID in March, April, May, June, by dipping into their credit lines or taking on state aid. We saw an debt to equity ratio increase of around 20%. So less equity, more debt. The debt load going forward for these businesses will be much higher. And we see a high proportion of cash tied up in working capital due to the large fluctuations in demand. And also investments in R&D, because the transformation does not go away. So overall, decreasing profitability, strategic issues about the consolidation in the market, problem in the core process of launching products, and higher debt load going forward. This certainly calls for a much higher distress factor going forward. Within PwC, we calculate a distress ratio, and this distress ratio internally has increased by roughly a third within the last 12 months, and this does not even include Q3 or Q4 COVID numbers with many of these suppliers. On the next slide, please. Thanks. I'll give you an overview about how supply chain risk is seen and treated within the automotive industry. That is very different from the point of view you're on. As a start, the distress in supply chain is nothing new or surprising. It is part of the supply chain for the last years or even decades. The industry has overall very established processes for regular quality and delivery issues. And in the very big picture, even the shutdown and restart in April, May, June could be managed without major disruptions, not the least supported by the fact that demand was not where it should have been. My focus here is more on the financial distress and the potential disruption of the supply chain going forward, and not on a single supplier which has a problem with output or quality of certain products, which in itself also can create enough problems. Let's start with the OEM side of the supply chain. OEMs usually have fully dedicated supply chain risk teams. Many of them even proactive and reactive, so dealing with the analysis and the treatment of, let's call it yellow flag suppliers, and the others dealing with the red flag suppliers. It is clearly central control and clearly defined processes and guidelines, and close coordination with all operations functions. A task force at an OEM level always includes operations, procurement, R&D, logistics. So this is a holistic approach and a clear willingness to drive a restructuring process. Either in Europe or in the US, it's the same. OEMs have a seat at the table and they will drive a tier 1 restructuring in order to mitigate their supply chain risk. If we look on the tier 1 side of the business, that's a very different picture. We have some of the large multinationals who are almost as good or as basically prepared as the OEMs. Many of them still working with decentralized teams, and many of them still rely on the OEMs to drive the restructuring, because in the end, it's the OEM's car. So OEMs are giving or setting the tone in these restructuring or in distressed cases in the supply chains. And at tier 1s, especially with the medium-sized tier 1s, the teams are often more on an ad hoc basis, because for them, distressed suppliers are basically not daily business, as for the OEM, where distressed suppliers are daily business. On the tier 2 and 3 level, it's a totally different story. We are entering uncharted territory here. There is not much transparency about the automotive supply chain on the tier 2, tier 3 territory. Usually no dedicated teams, seldom experience with large distress situations, and no or little understanding of the financial situation in their supply chain. Not the least by the situation that many of their suppliers, or the tier 2 and tier 3s, are smaller companies which usually do not have the necessity to basically show public financials. So it is clear that the transparency in the supply chain diminishes by the tiers from the OEM to the tier 2 and tier 3. And we're certainly leaving the, let's call it, structured approach when we're going into the tier 2 and tier 3 support or part of the supply chain. Next slide, please. How to set up professional risk management. Clearly, historically, OEMs and banks have led the way here. How should a professional supply chain risk management should look these days? The ability to transfer often fuzzy and unclear early warning signs, which everybody in this industry hears or sees, because this is a very tight-knit industry. Basically, it's a large industry, but it's playing basically by the same rules for everybody. So it is very clear, or you often hear some rumors on problems in the supply chain, but acting on that and having a clear strategy how to deal with these events basically separates the good from the not so good. We see 6 main areas which influence the outcome of a distress situation massively, or even contribute to avoid potential situations. First one, dedicated teams. I already talked about proactive and reactive risk management, but clear separation from the regular supplier management, as banks do in their credit engagements. They all have a workout department. They have a clear transfer of a credit agreement from the good book to the bad book. The same for professional supplier risk management in the OEMs or on the tier 1 side. Structured analysis, definition of clear KPIs, financial KPIs, based on their own research, or basically research which is publicly available. Clear transfer of responsibility if suppliers become distressed. So same with banks and the OEMs, the responsibility for the supply chain and the supply of this supplier clearly goes to the risk management department, and the risk management department has to be involved in every decision. And the ability to pull together cross-functional teams. Distress in the supply chain is rarely an individual item. It's not logistics or procurement. It's not R&D or finance. In many cases, is all of the above. And last but not least, active participation in the restructuring process, in and out of court restructurings, basically seat on creditors committees in order to have a clear path forward out of the distress situation. And continuous monitoring and analysis of scenarios. Everybody has to know his own dependencies, his chances for resourcing, and his chances for risk minimization. Because if I don't know that, I'm basically in a black hole in which I have no idea how to get out or what to do about in different scenarios. So having that said, these 6 items basically are the key pillars for professional supply chain risk management in the automotive area. On the next slide, getting a bit away from the setup of the supply chain risk management and more to what do we expect or what do we hope that changes in the future and going forward, and what are the lessons learned. We have basically 2 major areas. The first one is sourcing strategy. Clear, historically, it was always good to have a very cheap single source out of China. That may not be true past COVID. We have to reduce lead times in the supply chains. Certainly going more regional will mitigate trade barriers. The trend, even with the US going in a different direction, hopefully, the trade barriers and trade wars will not end. This will be certainly a problem going forward. So overall mitigation of supply chain risks is easier on a regional level and on a global level. So the demand for build where you sell will not end for the suppliers. It's an OEM trend, which will even go more into the supply chain. Dual sourcing is often talked about. It's certainly one way to decrease supplier dependency, but you will have to keep in mind, if you double source 50-50, and you have capacities of a reserve capacity, which is usual in the industry of like 15 to 20%, basically having 2 suppliers with 50% and each 20% capacity does not help you in the long run if one of the suppliers has a severe and ongoing distress situation. It certainly helps to relocate business. It certainly helps to overcome a delivery problem within days or weeks. But in the long run, it's about capacity increase in the supply chains in order to mitigate longer disruption in the supply chain. And supply chain transparency. I already talked about tier 2s and tier 3s. We have seen and worked with OEMs on the global level, which drive a very tough program to improve the visibility on the tier 2 and tier 3 side of the business, because even there we have in many cases suppliers with 300, 500, 700 million revenues, privately owned, very hard to see into their financial situation. But nevertheless, this is still a major part, especially of the European footprint of many suppliers. And there are ongoing efforts to increase reaction speed and build more trust in this value chain and supply chain in order to improve visibility and transparency. As the, let's call it last comment from my side here, resiliency is on the same level as cost optimization. Certainly after COVID and everything we've learned from COVID, historically it was all about cost, and the focus basically shifted more to, it's still about cost, certainly, but also on how resilient is my supply chain going forward, and how do I consider in the sourcing of my next programs as an OEM or as a tier 1 or 2 down in the supply chain. So having said that, thank you for your attention and happy to take questions.
Hello, Thomas. Hi, Andreas. I've got a question that's coming in the background here. You obviously mentioned transparency in the supply chain there. The question is, do you think that that is simple to achieve, or for most departments are supplier risk teams sometimes resistant to this increased transparency?
That certainly is not easy to achieve because it has had a lot to do with trust, that some of the tier 2s and tier 3s are rather reluctant to give out any information which is not basically within the normal award of a business. So there's certainly work to do. We had some experience, or we have some experience here with basically us working as a independent third party, when we're working regularly with OEMs and tier 2s, basically on these independent third party things, in order to build a common base about what is the real financial need, what is the real need for a price increase, or the situation. This makes it in many cases easier for the supplier basically to open up.
Let me also probably answering. I mean, what we said very important is having the transparency and then also evaluate. Yeah. If you know the potential supplier where probably the risk actually is coming from, it's always good then to have a deeper look on that and also then probably evaluate the supplier. But at the end, as long as the supplier is a supplier, I mean, it's also a partner, right? And then you have to have a deeper look on the one hand side, and on the other side, you also have a dual source strategy or something like that to mitigate that risk. Yeah. So, I mean, what we said before, transparency is really, really important to handle the risks even before they occur. Yeah.